Hello everyone, welcome to Botany Option channel for UPSC examination. In today's video, we are going to see the simple and basic topic called the pollination. As you know, this is a very important step in the plant kingdom, which is followed by the fertilization and the formation of fruit. So let us see about the pollination. Now, this has been given in your unit number 3 and paper number 1. Here we have the pollination. Now, first of all, what is pollination? Now, pollination is nothing but the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the flower. As you know, what are the pollen grains in flower and what is the stigma in the flower. We have discussed pollen grain in one of our video and stigma as well. So the transferring of these pollen grains from anther to the stigma, this process is called as the pollination. As you know, in a flower, there are structures present. We called it as androecium and gynoecium. Now, androecium is responsible for the pollen grain, while the gynoecium is responsible for the stigma. Now, there are certain types of the pollination. The very first is self-pollination and second is the cross-pollination. Now, self-pollination may be defined as it is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma of the same flower. That is, if the pollens are transferring from anther to the stigma of the same flower, then such a type of pollination is called as the self-pollination. You have to remember here the same flower. The example for this is a pea. Now, what happens in pea plants? The pollen grain from the same flower is transferred to the stigma of the same flower, and that is why such a type of pollination is called as the self-pollination. In second type of pollination, there is the cross-pollination, is occurs when the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma in different flower. That is, it does not transfer to the same flower, but it transfer to the different flower. That is, transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma of the same flower, it is called self-pollination. And if the pollens are transferring from anther to stigma of the different flower, then it is called as the cross-pollination. Now again, there are types of the self-pollination as well. Now self-pollination can be divided as a autogamy and deuterogamy. Now, as we know about the self-pollination, that is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the same flower, it is called self-pollination. Then in autogamy, what happens? Now this autogamy may be defined as the transferring of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the same flower. That is, there is only one flower, and in that flower we have both, that is androecium and gynoecium. We called it as a bisexual flower. Now, this bisexual flower which possesses both the sexes on the same flower, it transfers the pollen grain from anther to the stigma of the same flower. So there is no need of second flower. That is transferring. That is, in this case, the pollens are transferring from anther to the stigma in the one flower only. There is no involvement of second flower, right? So such a type of pollination is called as the autogamy. While on the other hand, the deuterogamy may be defined as the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma from one flower to the another flower which is present on the same plant. That is, plant is same, it is not different. But if there are two flowers on the same plant and one flower is transferring its pollen grains to the another flower, in such a condition, such a type of pollination is called as deuterogamy. Now, self-pollination is divided into autogamy and deuterogamy. Autogamy when the bisexual flower, that is one flower only involved in the pollination, and in deuterogamy, two flowers are involved in the pollination of the same plant. But as the flowers belongs to the same plant only, that is why these are called as the self-pollinated plants. Now, what are the advantages of this self-pollination? Now, very first advantage of this self-pollination is sure method of pollination. That is, there are no chances of missing the pollination because both the androecium and gynoecium are present on the same plant, and that is why there are 100% chances of the pollination. That is sure, it is a sure method of pollination. Now, the second is it is the most economic. Now, for transferring the pollen grains from anther to the stigma, these plants do not require any type of energy. That is, they don't have to transfer their pollen grains to the distance. That is, they don't have to transfer the pollen grains from one place to different place by using certain vectors. They just have to transfer the pollen grains from their anther to their stigma. That is why this process is the most economic process. Then third one is it is the least wastage of pollen grains. Now, what happens when in a self-pollinated plant, all the pollen grains are tried to used to transfer to the stigma. So there is no wastage of pollen grains. Then the fourth application or the fourth advantage of the self-pollination is the genetic stability is maintained. As you know, pollens are transferring from anther to stigma of the same flower. There is no external genetic makeup. That is, there were no external genes in this process because the anther of the same flowers transferring pollen grains to the same flower stigma. And that is why genetic constitution of that organism is maintained. All right. Then what are the disadvantages of this self-pollination? Well, the very first disadvantage of this self-pollination is no chance of improved variety. As we have discussed that if pollen grains are transferring from anther of the same flower to the stigma of the same flower, there is no genetic recombination. All right. If there is no genetic recombination, there are no genes, so there will be no improved varieties. Variety will remain as it is. That is, the offsprings are very similar to their parents. Now, second, the undesirable characters are retained. Now, in every organism, there were the undesirable characters present, and whenever there is a continuous transfer of the same genome, these undesirable characters remain as it is in an organism. Then the progeny becomes weaker. Now, if self-pollination occur to the many generations, in such a case, due to the similar type of genetic makeup, the progeny of these organisms become weaker by generation. All right. Then there is a less viability of seeds. That is, the seeds produced by the self-pollination are the less viable. That is, their ability to grow and adapt to the environment is very less. Now, the fifth disadvantage is it doesn't favor the variation. That is, due to the self-pollination, there is a no change in the genetic makeup, and that is why there were the no variations in the genome. Now, variations are considered as a very important part of an evolution because variations make the organism very well adapted to the environment. But in this case of self-pollination, there were the no variation because self-pollination is occurring and the organism have the same genetic material. That is why it does not favor the variation or the process of evolution. Now let's talk about the second type of pollination, that is the cross-pollination. Now cross-pollination occurs when there is a transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the different flower. All right. So this type of phenomenon, that is the cross-pollination, can be found in the papaya flower and the cotton flower. Both are the examples for the cross-pollination. That is, it is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the different flower. Right. Now there are two types of this cross-pollination. First is the xenogamy and second is the hybridization. Now this xenogamy may be defined as it is a transferring of pollen grains from anther of one flower to the stigma of the another flower of the same species. That is, species is same. That is, if you consider, here is the example of papaya, and here is the first plant of papaya, and there is the second plant of papaya. Both have flowers. Now, when the pollen grains are transferred from this flower to the second papaya plant, pollen of one plant is transferring to the stigma of the another plant, right? But both these plants is the same species, that is the papaya species. Now, when transferring of pollen grains from anther of one flower to the stigma of the another flower of the same species, then this process is called as the xenogamy. While in hybridization, what happens? It is a transfer of pollen grains from one plant to the another plant of a different variety or species. Now, when the pollen grains are transferred from one plant to the another plant of a different species or variety, then such a type of cross-pollination is called as the hybridization. And example for this is the cotton flower. Now, in a cross-pollination, we have two types, xenogamy and the hybridization. In a xenogamy, we have example of a papaya, and in hybridization, we have example of a cotton flower. All right. Then what are the advantages of this cross-pollination? Now, the very first advantages is that it brings the variation because the pollen grains are not landed on the same flower but the different flower. That is why there is a genetic recombination between the two species, and that is why variations are produced. And these variations are very useful in the evolution. The second, undesirable characters eliminates. That is, the undesirable characters which are present from generation to generation may be eliminated in the subsequent generation. Then the third advantage is improved varieties of hybrid. That is, due to the cross-pollination, improved varieties of the hybrids were created. Then better vigor and vitality. That is, the plants which are produced by the cross pollination have the better adaptability to the environment, and they have the more power for the survival of fittest, and that is why we called it as a better, those a plant which has a better vigor and the vitality. Then at last it favors the process of evolution. As we have discussed that it produces the variation, and that is why it favors the process of evolution, because in evolution variations are must, and due to this variation these cross-pollinated plants are very well adapted to the nature. All right. Then what are the disadvantages of this cross-pollination? The very first is pollination is not sure. As you know, transferring of the pollen grains from one flower to the another flower, it is not definite that these pollen grains will landed at the same place, and pollination is not sure because these plants are separated by certain distance, and that is why pollination is not sure. Second, it is not economical because the transferring of pollen grains of the one plant to the stigma of the another plant require tremendous amount of energy, and that is why we call this process as a not economical. Then there is a wastage of pollen grains. Of course, while transferring from one flower to the another flower, there is a wastage of some of the pollen grains due to the various environmental reasons. Alright. Then desirable characters may got eliminated. As we have discussed, during the genetic recombination, some unfavorable characters may get eliminated, but at the same time, some desirable and good characters may get eliminated from the progeny. Then purity is not maintained. As we have discussed in a self-pollination, the purity is maintained because the genetic makeup remains the same. But in a cross-pollination, genetic makeup does not remain same and it changes, and that is why there is no purity in the cross-pollination. So thank you very much for watching this video. Please like the video. Please share this video with your friends who are studying the botany. Please share this video with your friends who are studying the botany, and please subscribe to the botany option channel for UPSC examination. And we have Telegram channel of the same name. Please subscribe that too. And we have Twitter account, and please follow us on Twitter as well so that we will remain in contact. Again, thank you very much for watching this video. See you in the next one.